great pleasure and it is a great privilege to introduce to you this evening. I'm going to start with the author of the book, Professor Emeritus Professor Wieland Gevers, who qualified in medicine with a first-class honours at the University of Cape Town in 1960. And after that, he proceeded as a Rhodes Scholar to Oxford University to obtain the D.Phil degree in 1966 under the Nobel Prize winner Sir Hans Krebs. He then spent 4 postdoctoral years in the laboratory of yet another Nobelist, Dr. Fritz Lipman, at the Rockefeller University in New York. Professor Gevers was a professor of medical biochemistry at UCT and has been president of the South African Biomedical Society, the Royal Society of South Africa, and the Academy of Sciences of South Africa. He represented all South African universities on the South African Qualifications Authority, SAQA, from 1996 to 2002. He holds a Distinguished Teachers Award and a Life Fellowship from UCT, and he was a Senior Deputy Vice Chancellor from 1996 and 2002, and then Interim Director of the Institute of Infectious Diseases and Molecular Medicine, which I believe he helped found. I'm now going to introduce Emeritus Professor Anwar Mall. I think so many of you here know both speakers. But let me tell you about Professor Mall. Emeritus Professor Mall holds a BSc degree with majors in physiology and biochemistry from the University of Durban-Westville. And he has a BSc Honours and Med and an MSc in Surgical Sciences from UCT, and he also holds a PhD from University of Newcastle upon Tyne in the United Kingdom. His research focused on the role of mucus in health and disease in the surgical research laboratories in the Division of General Surgery at UCT, where he trained honours, masters and PhD students and presented at approximately 30 conferences. He's taught at both undergraduate and postgraduate levels in the Faculty of Health Sciences, and like Professor Gevers, he also was the recipient of the Distinguished Teacher Award, and he exited his career at UCT as a Deputy Vice Chancellor of Transformation during, I think we'll all remember, as an extremely difficult time. So please welcome these 2 distinguished gentlemen.
Well, thank you very much, Mitty. I didn't entirely recognize myself there, but thank you. Now, so I've been asked to mention 2 apologies from Professor Val Mizrahi and Professor Solly Benneter, who couldn't make it this evening. But it's my enormous pleasure to be here today. I have been, Professor Gevers and I know each other for sort of almost 4 decades, and we've become very close friends, and we've shared a lot, and I've learned a lot from him. But tonight it's my turn to question the professor. So it's the other way around. And I do hope he passes the examination. I'm going to start by asking Prof questions about his book, The Meaning of Life, A South African Scientist's Tale. And we'll speak for a while, and then we'll invite the audience to actually ask questions. So, Prof, let us begin. By the way, Prof asked me to call him Wieland. I've never called him Wieland ever. And I'm not about to do that now. Okay. So I'm going to say, I'm going to start by saying congratulations on this book, Prof. And it certainly provides the reader with a glimpse into a well-lived life, a path well trodden. What made you write it?
Thank you very much, and could I also thank you all for coming here this evening. I much appreciate that. In answering that, I'd like to say that at the beginning of the book, I say that Socrates said that the unexamined life is not worth living. And this is part of my answer to Anwar's question, why did you write the book? Because I examined my life constantly, but because of the extreme busyness of my life, it was only possible when I had retired more recently to be able to look back and to examine that life very closely. And the best way to do that is to write it up as an autobiography. Now, I know that Socrates didn't actually mean what I've done. In other words, when he said this at his trial, he meant that he wasn't prepared to accept a life in which he wasn't examining himself and his beliefs all the time. They wanted to banish him or kill him, so he preferred to death to banishment, because he said a life that is not being examined is not worth living. In my case, I did in fact examine my life all the time, but this look back, if I say apologies to Socrates, long dead, that I've adapted his phrase to say that I looked back and looked at some patterns and some of the meaning of that life. And you'll see that in doing that, it turned out that I appeared to have had about 9 different phases in my life, in each of which I had to go back and start at some sort of new beginning. And in each of which I responded by trying very hard and trying to change the system in which I was working. So there was a pattern there, and it is that pattern which we'll be discussing as we go along. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So, Prof, you've written quite considerably about your early life, and that helped me understand some of the forces that shaped your life. But you excelled well beyond expectation. And this seems to be a recurring theme of your life story, that you excelled in whatever you did. Why?
Well, this is going to be a slightly longer answer than you expect.
Okay.
It's essentially...
Yeah.
Sorry, it's a slightly longer answer than you expect. Essentially, the self-examination began when I was a child. And when I looked at myself as an individual mind, as an individual person, and began to separate myself from the rest of my family and the rest of society as an autonomous being. And I soon realized that I was somebody who had broad interests rather than narrow interests. If I can use again a Greek idea, there's a fable about the fox and the hedgehog. Now, this fable can be summed up by saying that the hedgehog knows one big thing, but the fox knows many things, because the fox keeps changing from one activity to the other and carries baggage from one activity to the other. So, therefore, what really happened in my life, to answer your question about having lower expectations than the actual performance, is that as a fox you always enter a new territory. The hedgehog knows the territory and is comfortable and knows exactly what can be expected, what can be achieved. The fox is always entering new territory, is always scouting and trying to see how are you going to shape up in this new environment, and exactly how will your talent, such as it is, be able to match what you are setting out to do. So this pattern was absolutely constant. Every single time, if you read the book, you'll see that even when I was appointed a professor at UCT, having been a professor at Stellenbosch, I came to UCT and I found that everything looked very difficult to make a success of it. All kinds of things looked impossible to do or looked very difficult to do, and there were great obstacles in my path. Some of those are described in the book, and you'll see that I had to struggle and eventually to change things in order to be able to succeed. So it's the psychological barrier of always being in new territory and not knowing how well you can do in that territory. And that began from early on and persisted right through my life to the end.
Thank you, yes. I never thought of you as a fox, but that's a very nice metaphor. So, Prof, you got honors for your undergraduate medical studies at UCT. And then, well, you did an internship and you took a completely different path and went into research completely with no clinical attachment whatsoever. So, and then you worked with 2 Nobel laureates, Hans Krebs and Franz Lippmann. during your career, your doctoral and postdoctoral career. What made you make such a big turn from clinical medicine?
Yes, this is something which happens to medical students, that they go through what is an extremely interesting and broad course compared with many other degree courses at the university. The breadth of a typical medical curriculum is unique in the university and gives you exposure on all fronts, on the psychological front, on the physical front, and on the different levels of understanding of nature. So therefore it's an extremely broad education. I observed during the time that I was in clinical study, I observed that the people who impressed me, the people who could explain what was going on in a patient very carefully and scientifically, were the ones that appeared to have the best way of explaining both to the medical students and to the patient. And I was amazed at how often these were also the most humane people, that their relations with the patients were much better than you'd expect from a person who is supposedly hard scientifically inclined, as opposed to people who are social science inclined. So I found this very impressive, that the scientific understanding of human bodies in health and sickness allowed one to be able to understand natural things very carefully, but also human relationships and human nature. And this began during my medical studies, and I was able to do a project with one of these stars that I admired. And we had our first paper published in the Medical Students Research Journal in Younger. And just after graduation, Professor Dowdle, Eugene Dowdle, invited me into his lab, and I learnt the ropes there, and again was enormously impressed. And when I got to Oxford, and then after that to New York, I had the privilege of working in two absolutely wonderful laboratories. You mentioned that I worked with Professor Hans Krebs, and with Fritz Lippmann. But it's important to say that Hans Krebs, in fact, isn't just a Nobel Prize winner. He is one of the stars of the Nobel Prizes, because he actually made discoveries which have universal meaning. The whole of life, which uses oxygen, makes energy through the Krebs cycle. And so he was an enormously impressive person. And when I got there, I found that he had a medical education first. And when I said to him, look, I've only done first year physics and first year chemistry, he said, don't worry. You're a medical graduate and you've got two enormous assets. You've got that broad training and you know how to work. And therefore you'll make quick progress. And when I got to New York with a second Nobel Prize winner, Fritz Lippmann, he is the person who explained how living processes use energy. In other words, the way in which you move, the way in which your brain works, the way in which your gut absorbs your food, etc. All that is dependent on ATP, the universal energy currency, the dollar, if you like, of our biology, the one that is the universal currency, which Lippmann made that discovery, and again, a superb laboratory, again, a medically trained person. And so the answer to your question is that I was confirmed in my belief that what had happened was that I had the right training as a medical student, but should move into science because that is where I could find my way.
Thank you, Prof. So, Prof, I remember in conversations with my PhD supervisor in Newcastle, Professor Adrian Allen, who was a friend of yours, and he used to say to me that Wieland Gevers could have got a job anywhere else in the world after New York, but he chose to come back to South Africa. And you came back to a country during a bad period in its history, beset with a whole lot of issues. And you came to Stellenbosch and then to UCT. Has it worked out, you think, or did you make the right decision?
Well, again, in looking back at the whole life, I couldn't have made a better decision than to come back. Because, in a sense, this was my home, this is where my emotional life was centered, and this is where, in fact, the opportunities and possibilities of making a contribution towards the resolution of those great problems that were afflicting the country. That is a decision I have never regretted. And it has proved possible in the environment to make such contributions as would have made the country better able to prosper. And we'll talk about that later.
Okay.
Thank you.
So Prof, I remember I was one of the beneficiaries of your teaching. It was very inspirational. But your teaching wasn't confined to a classroom. I remember at medical school, you set up the Pfizer lectures, which were a huge success, with a full attendance of scientists and clinicians to those lectures. And then later on, when you were the Deputy Vice Chancellor, you organized a distinguished professor program where you got some very, very important or very famous people at UCT, like George Ellis and Company, to give open lectures to entire UCT community. Now, you said that the reason for that was to offer their wisdom to a wider range of students across the university in new formats like seminars and debates. So, what was your motive for these initiatives?
This is one of the more problematic areas of my life, if I may say so at the beginning of my answer. Essentially, it was always something that had its origins in my own growing up phase, the breadth of my interests and my different cultural interests and broad curiosity. And that I felt that one needed in a university to be able to savor not just the wisdom of one faculty, but one needed to be able to drink at the fountain, which was a much bigger fountain, the whole university. So in various ways we tried that. At one point we started university lectures, which were organized with enormous care, in the sense that lecturers were very carefully chosen, topics were chosen, advertisements, flyers were put on every single lecture desk in the whole university before the day when the lecture was offered. And these were offered on topics such as the architecture of UCT. What are the buildings, what is the style of the buildings, when were they built, who built them, and how do they compare, and what are the problems, etc. Topics such as the rise and fall. Professor Bundy spoke about the rise and fall of the South African peasantry, this very important topic of agriculture in the early days. And there were many other topics which were chosen to be attractive to a wide audience. Now, what the disappointing thing was that every single time that we had a politically charged lecture, there was a mass attendance. Every single time the lecture had no immediate political charge in it. For example, William Bond, Fellow of the Royal Society, wonderful botanist understanding ecological botany, his lecture on the vegetation of Africa in this entire university attracted 31 people. And that I give you as an absolute extreme. Whereas Colin Bundy's lecture had attracted the entire New Science Lecture Theatre, 500 plus people turned up. You couldn't get standing room. So as a generalization, I'd concluded that most people limit their focus in their studies at UCT to the immediate problem of passing the exams and of getting on top of their degree studies. But that in fact there's only a core of people who extend their interest and are willing to look at something else beyond that. Now that's a very pessimistic conclusion, but I'm afraid it happened again when Martin de Wit and I offered a series on Africa. The series gave 16 lectures on every aspect of Africa. William Bond's lecture was in that series. We had the music of Africa, we had the higher education in Africa right from the beginning in every country in the whole continent. We had every aspect, medicine in Africa, we had every single topic you could imagine, 16 of those. And there was a regular attendance of about 40 people, and it never grew beyond that. Even though in the Leslie Social Science building where we held the lectures, there was a lot of people having lunch and talking and jabbering as they entertained themselves, and that they wouldn't come into that lecture to hear something. So the answer to you is that the Distinguished Professor scheme at UCT led to what I call the periodic episodes when UCT becomes small-minded. Because the Senate debate on distinguished professorships, a select group of people to be asked to go beyond their own disciplines and to give university lectures on the things that they preoccupied them. First of all, in the Senate debate, we had all kinds of people saying that all professors are equal. There must be no distinguished professors or extraordinary professors or junior professors or anything like that. And so this extreme small-mindedness expressed itself in a Senate debate where we managed to get a majority of about 2. And so we had distinguished professors, but it never worked. It never caught fire because the institution had closed its ears to that. I'm sorry to say this story, but you also have to have the good things and the bad things mixed together.
Yeah.
So Anwar, I'm afraid that it's been a lifelong struggle to. I greatly admire the summer school, UCT Extramural Studies Summer School, because it is such a wonderful example of people who come to hear something new, something outside of life's ordinary course. And it is one of the great assets and jewels of UCT. So the answer is that this is human nature. And the distinguished professor idea died at UCT. Stellenbosch copycatted it and has had great success attracting important people like Jonathan Jansen,
Yes.
and many others.
Yeah.
So therefore they've had a great success of it because they didn't think it was wrong to have people with that title, provided they were expected to do extraordinary things. So this is a story which is one of the underside of my story, because I'm disappointed by it.
Right. Yeah, Prof, you mentioned Stellenbosch, and when I read about it in your book, I was amazed, because this is Africa's premier institution. And yet it didn't work here where you think it would work, and it worked. Well, I'm not undermining Stellenbosch, but I mean, it worked there. There must have been some other factors involved for them to be so successful in that regard.
You mean in respect of the distinguished professor scheme?
Yes, yes.
Well, you see, Stellenbosch has had a different academic tradition. Initially, it was very German influenced, and Germans have got this extraordinary professor, etc. So I think it fell on more fertile ground. And I think we just happened to strike this university, when it was in one of its small-minded moods. It happens from time to time.
Prof, you say in your book, Mampela and I, well, Mampela is here, welcome. Mampela, don't hold it against Prof, but this is what he says. Mampela and I needed to take UCT out of its static existence and help it rise to the new challenge of being a better institution in South Africa. Could you explain that?
Yes, thank you. I also want to welcome Mampela for coming this evening. She's written one of the endorsements on the cover of the book, for which I'm very grateful. Now, essentially, this is a very difficult, it would take me almost an hour to give you a proper answer, but I'll try to do it very briefly. Essentially, when Mampela was appointed Vice-Chancellor, we found that we were kindred spirits in many ways. It was personal at the level of sense of humor and interest in certain kinds of things, but it was also the feeling that the university was a magnificent institution, but that there were certain things that took a long time to happen, because there was a conservatism built into the very structure of the university. For example, in Dr. Saunders' magnificent 16 years of vice-chancellorship, there hadn't been, apart from the academic development program and the efforts that were made to smooth the transition of underprepared students into the undergraduate programs, there hadn't been an actual change in the way in which the university's faculties offered their degrees. And so we needed now to, both because of the fact that we were going to have more and more students coming in, and there was a real need for curriculum, for looking at the curriculum in order to be able to make this work. But we also needed to look at new possibilities of running the university differently. And so, to some extent, Mompila and I had a different set of ideas of how to do that, but they were perfectly matched. And we assigned the roles to each other, and we pushed them and supported each other in order to be able to make those things happen. And so in those 4 years, the university, the number of faculties changed, departmental headships changed, the model changed for academic planning, etc. So a lot of things happened in that short time. That on Mompila may have a different view, but that's more or less summarizes my view of it.
You'll be invited to comment later. So, Prof, when it comes to curriculum reform, okay, and you worked on it on both an institutional and national context, right? Now, UCT had an academic planning framework, and you say there that what you wanted was a specification of degree purpose with compulsory core and optional complementary courses, and examination outcomes determined by minimum achievement of the relative degree purpose. That exercise was not successful. Why?
Yes, I think that we're beginning now with a discussion of two topics which are related to each other. The first is the institutional effort at curriculum reform, which were directly contemporaneous with the national effort as a result of the National Commission on Higher Education and the formation by law of the South African Qualifications Authority and the policy approach towards a national qualifications framework. And so this will be an answer which I'll try to cover first the institutional level, but it must be understood that they were happening at the same time and influenced each other very much. So the full picture will only emerge when we have done both sides. But I'll try to deal with the first side. Now, I had a lot of time in the UK and in USA in looking at universities and how they offer their undergraduate degrees. The American university is typically a liberal arts bachelor, 4-year bachelor, in which students were required to take courses from different domains of knowledge. So a BA at Harvard would mean somebody would have to take something from the physical sciences, whether it was engineering subject or physics subject, something from the biological sciences, something from the social sciences, etc. And the curricula were, the main majors and minors were well defined, what you had to do. In Britain, at both Oxford and Cambridge, for example, which I understood well, there were programmed bachelor degrees, which were either 3 years or 4 years. The 4-year ones were called honor degrees, literally equivalent to our honors, but continuous over 4 years, not broken up into a degree plus honors. And so these were all named, and they all had a purpose, and they all had a prescribed curriculum. And in each case, the curriculum was prescribed, but options were also prescribed. But they could be from a group of subjects, not from any subject under the sun. So that in general, they were structured and planned and prescribed. Now, I started as a Deputy Vice-Chancellor responsible for academic matters, teaching and learning it's called now, it's academic matters then. And the task was to see to what extent one was dealing with a university in which some faculties, engineering and medicine being classic examples, the faculty spent a great deal of time debating whether the student should do one course of this or half a course of that, or have this option or a free choice of courses, and this language, conversational language, for example. And a lot of time went into laying down what would make this the best kind of doctor, able to go into specialization or into general practice or into research or whatever. And same in engineering. And of course, in both cases, there's a professional council laying down the law as well. Now, if you come to the social sciences and arts and science at UCT, there was no such external council prescribing what had to be done. There was also a credit accumulation model, a major, and a way of saying you must have so many credits at this level, so many credits at this level, so much at this, but it was a free choice pretty well. There were some restrictions and some requirements, but generally speaking, you could put the thing together any which ways. So it meant that people had an enormous variety of reasons why they had particular courses in their BA or BSoc-Sci or BSc. One reason may be that the lecture was at 8 o'clock in the morning. And one reason may be that the exam was thought to be particularly difficult to pass in a subject. And so therefore one had all kinds of reasons why people chose their particular subjects. Sometimes it found that it was very easy to pass in a subject, and that was a very popular course. So therefore we thought that if the rest of the world, the best universities, prescribe what a degree which is majoring in a particular topic like English or psychology or whatever it may be, then shouldn't they put their heads together and say that these people should be doing this? Should a psychologist not do physiology, for example, to understand what is actually in that head that you're going to be reading in professionally for so long? And all kinds of other ways of thinking about what would make these people better able to understand contextually and consiliently their main subjects or subjects. And so the academic planning framework, amongst other recommendations, prescribed that this is how we might plan in future. And of course it went through Senate and Council without any hitches whatsoever. It's only when people in the university actually began to realize what it meant for them that resistance began to build up. But to cut a long story short, we eventually managed to have the program get to the point where all the faculties that had these kinds of unstructured, not prescribed curricula, offering a number of courses. PPE, politics, philosophy, and economics, was popular in both commerce and in the humanities. And we had film and media studies was a popular option in the humanities, etc. There were many others. But administratively, it was a bit of a nightmare because you were transitioning from an old system into a new system with overlapping years. The handbooks became very big in order to cope with that. And eventually, the whole institution, in a sense, decided to just leave it unless it had been particularly successful. And those that I mentioned, they have remained. And so I accept that this was not the right thing for the institution at that time. I still wonder whether the idea originally was not the right idea. If it is the right idea at Princeton and Harvard and Chicago, should it not be the right idea at UCT? And so it remains something which I consider unfinished business. But you'll see how this resonates with the Sakwa national story in a minute.
So if we go into the Sakwa one, where you represented all South African universities on the SAQA Qualifications Authority for 6 crucial years. So as I understand it, this work was mainly behind the scenes. What were the big issues that you had to deal with there in the South African Qualifications Authority?
Yeah. Yeah, you're referring now to the qualifications framework, yes. Essentially, when the ANC came to power under the Mandela cabinet in 1994, one of the main objectives in its educational area of preparation for power and preparation for change, one of the main focus was on especially in the context of the country as it was, with people being prevented from studying, having so many reasons why they couldn't fulfill their talent. That there should be recognition of prior learning, and there should be an easy way of being able to acquire qualifications through a number of activities over a time, etc. This was called unit standards, and it was very much a done thing and established in vocational training, still is, but unit standards were now thought to be the way to go to turn all education into standards which could be standardized nationally. So that a standard, for example, in English would have a national design, national requirements and national outcomes that would have to be followed in every institution at a particular level. So that was the philosophy at the time in the government, and that is what the National Commission was wrestling with. John File was from this institution, and he enrolled me into his technical team to work on the qualifications for higher education, because the Commission was clearly uncomfortable with simply adopting a unit standards approach to the whole of higher education. So in working with John and the rest of that technical team, we began to design a model that would accommodate the intention of policy intention of the government, but not disrupt the whole educational model. And that was to regard whole qualifications as the standard. And that means that the BA, for example, would be a standardized degree where every university offering that BA would have to say that the students having done that, having acquired that degree, would be able to do this and that and that. We've reached that level of education. And so when I was then appointed to SAQA, to the National South African Qualifications Authority, this is what I, as the only university person in a 32-person body, had to defend against a lot of trade unionists and all kinds of zealots who had very different ideas about how higher education could be totally revolutionized and reformed. But eventually, after much hard work, we got this accepted, that in higher education it would be possible to accommodate higher education in a national qualifications framework that covered everything from school to adult education and doctoral degrees, etc., by having the whole qualification standardized in some way. Now, that meant that this work was then farmed out to the equivalent that was then called SAUVCA, South African Universities Vice Chancellors Association, now called Universities South Africa, which therefore, under my chairmanship of the Education Committee, accepted the task of setting the first standards as examples that it could be done. So we made teams to look at the Bachelor of Social Science, the Bachelor of Science, Bachelor of Arts, etc. And we had teams that actually designed a model for a standard for these degrees. Went back to SAQA, and SAQA said, fine, they look good, let's have that, and let's now divide the NQF into this band, and the Council for Higher Education will do the auditing and the registration and the approval of degrees, etc., and together with the Department of Higher Education, or the department with responsibility for higher education. So, an enormous amount of work had to be done to be able to enable universities to do this. But suddenly the chair of SAQA was told by the then minister that we must now register all qualifications that are in the country, whatever they are, on the NQF. And so university, every registrar, including UA, got the letter that they had to register this on the NQF. These are the level descriptors. And you must now register our UCT degree on this, and you must do it in this particular way, and you must say what the outcomes are, etc. And that was quite a thing, because there were no outcomes known. They were just, this person's a BA from UCT, literate, maybe able to do this, maybe, etc. So therefore, the registrar did a heroic job, and we got the job done over a period of time. And then suddenly the Department of Education had asked Kathy Luckett and myself to design a system by which the universities would be enabled to do this more easily. So we wrote, and Nasima Badshah is here this evening. She was then the head of the higher education branch department. And so we worked together and we developed a nested model in which there was a descriptor of each degree and then of each degree's subdivision. So a Bachelor of Arts in, let's say, music, or a Bachelor of Art in English or psychology, whatever it may be, would be able to have this, meet the standard for the Bachelor of Arts first, and then a new standard for the Bachelor of Arts in what this is, and so on, to subdivisions. And this nested model we presented, and it seemed to fit the bill. And then a little later, we were all surprised when the department issued a national qualification framework with level descriptors for each of the levels. And so, if I can just now come back to what happened at UCT. So while I was busy fighting for whole qualifications, I knew that UCT was rejecting the idea that you could actually say in words what a BA or a BSOC-SCI graduate could do or was capable of further doing, could fit into a framework. But this was the requirement of the system, and it is the requirement of the system still. So to cut this rather long story short, which I know people will find tedious, I'm sorry for that, but it was a heroic battle. And eventually I believe that what came out of it, the NQF, has proved flexible enough for the university system to be able to propose a new postgraduate diploma in whatever it may be, organization and management, and to send it to the department for approval, and for the department to be able to look at the NQF and say, yes, we approve it, or we don't approve it. You can't just send a postgraduate diploma and say it's actually a master's degree. So to that extent, it does work as a regulatory device.
In the interest of time, because I want to get the audience involved, you contributed to the building of a national body, the Academy of Sciences, and locally you worked very hard to establish the IDM, which is very successful. How does ASAF, the Academy of Sciences, relate to universities?
Yes, thank you. Essentially, the Academy of Science of South Africa was formed in response to the transition to democracy in the country. There previously existed a Royal Society of South Africa, and still exists, and there's a Suid-Afrikaanse Akademie vir Wetenskap en Kunst, which still exists, but they were thought to be sectoral and not adequate and not appropriate. And therefore we set about, and this is the story of this is told in the book, and time is pressing. So therefore it was a long battle, but what we did eventually were able to do was to deviate from the traditional model of a national science academy. First of all, we said that this would be an academy of all the disciplines that are open-ended in knowledge terms. You know, we don't start with the truth and then try to buttress the truth by your research, but where you believe that there is a truth that you must find, and you set out to find it and to find evidence for it, and when you find it, it may not be conclusive, it may be upset later on. So open-ended. So all the disciplines that are there are historians in the academy, there are social scientists of every stripe and hue, and so therefore this was an open, much broader academy. The second is that it was not an academy of prestige, but an academy of service. So it was set so that it would be something where people from different universities would be able to be put together in panels to address important national issues or problems and to look at all the evidence and to recommend solutions. So that was different. So the answer to your question is that in a sense, the academy was designed to be the collective joint think tank of all the universities and science councils at once, which they would never in a month of Sundays be able to do on their own. And so, but yet they should support it because they have representatives on it, and it brings honor to the institution.
I have a burning and a bit of a contentious question. So if you were Vice Chancellor and you had students who came to you and said, our university should actually cut off ties with a particular university in a particular country because of human rights issues, how would you respond to that?
Sorry, I'm supposed to just to repeat that first part. I didn't catch it.
Okay, so I wanted to know, if you were the Vice Chancellor, how would you respond to a demand from students who say, UCT has got to cut ties with universities in another country because of human rights issues? What would you say to that?
Yeah, thank you. Sorry, I misunderstood. I think that this is something which is very nuanced in the sense that one has to examine extremely carefully what the risks are in everything that a university does. The primary purpose of the university is to be for generations to come a major resource of learning and furtherance of what one wants to do in one's life. The institution has to last. It has to be able to go on. Secondly, the council, which carries the responsibility of making sure that the university is working well, and the Vice-Chancellor in charge of that, has to look very, very carefully at risks in every situation. I think that comparisons are made sometimes when institutions have criticized or taken stands or put sanctions on other countries' universities, when it cost them nothing to do so, when there was absolutely no price to be paid. That is cheap. That's fine. But one must not compare something which could, in fact, destroy or damage the institution. That is a primary responsibility. All other responsibilities are secondary to that responsibility of the institutional head, in my view.
Prof, another combination of two questions. When you look back on your life, do you have any regrets? Do you think I could have done that differently? And what is the meaning you've extracted from all this? The meaning of the life that you've extracted from all this. So the first part of the question is, would you have done anything differently?
Well, I think that in looking back, it's clear that, and the audience will have been patient with me and will have heard that there were mistakes and there were failures along the way. I don't regret those. The attempts were made in sincerity and in the hope that there would be improvements. I think that the long look back, which is my last chapter, has revealed that I simply have to accept at this stage that I tried hard and that each of the phases required change in order to get somewhere. And that therefore the question of the meaning of a life is, to what extent do you feel that you have been able to do something to assist society, something that will allow other people to get on better than they would have otherwise, and for that the beauty of the world and the magnificence of the world is better preserved. That is the meaning of a life.
Thank you, Professor. So I'm very glad you're going to direct your questions, audience, to Professor Gevers and not to me. So I'm going to hand over to you. Thank you. And thank you, Prof.
Thank you. The session is being recorded, so blessings, if you just put your hand up, and then blessings will take the microphone to you, so please don't speak without the microphone. And can you share?
Yeah, well, I keep on.
Good evening, Wieland. Kit Vaughan here. Thanks very much indeed for the presentation, and I certainly look forward to reading the book. It's mentioned in the introduction that you had the very good fortune of working both at the PhD level and at the postdoc level with Nobel laureates. Having had that experience, and then you came back to South Africa, did you ever think perhaps that your own research might reach those great heights?
Thank you, Kit. I must confess to never having had the effrontery to believe that.
Prof, I don't think your mic's on.
Sorry.
Or is it? I'll put it next to you.
It is on now, I believe.
Yeah.
I never had the cheek to believe that. But I think that what did happen is that we were competitive. In other words, what I wanted to do was to see whether in South Africa we could have laboratories that were working at the same level as the ones that I admired and had experienced overseas. And it's amazing, for example, that in that Stellenbosch phase, that from literally nothing when I got there, that within the short space of 6 years, we actually made, the people in the lab made 3 observations that have turned out to be absolutely seminal. One of us, in a sabbatical in America, discovered microRNA. In fact, Nature recently published a history of these small RNAs, and in fact, the first paper on this was by Bester and Haywood from our group in Stellenbosch. Peter Jones was the first person to observe the effect of methylation of DNA on differentiation. And so the whole DNA methylation story started in our lab in Tygerberg in Stellenbosch. So therefore, and there are many other things. So therefore, what we were able to do was, in a relatively short time, get a team together by team spirit, because my belief was that you couldn't, it had to be something which was open and where everybody knew who could be consulted and who could be helped. And for example, we had jogging after hours, and all of us would go out and jog, and we would talk to each other about work, about issues and so on, and I'd move from one to the other, etc. So it was a team building thing. So what I wanted to do was to show that it could be done here, and it really has been done, because South Africa now has superb laboratories all over the place.
Thank you very much.
I just want to say, I just wanted to mention that you do mention in your book that both Nobel laureates spoke very highly of your work when you were there in relation to Kit's question. Yeah.
So, Professor Gevers, thank you so much. That was wonderful. Very excited to read your book. And just to kick off from what you've just said, when I think about my role in the university, the things that drive us, there's teaching and education, it's the opportunities to uplift the next generation of young people. It's in healthcare, it's the ability to change the lives of people under your care and progressively change your community. And in science, it's about discovery. It's the curiosity-driven mind, the things that drive us to discover new things about nature, about the human body, about healthcare. So those are the things that get me very excited about being part of the university. But when I go to a Senate meeting, then it seems that there's this disconnect between the passions that I associate with the university and the collective passions in the Senate. And I usually, the Senate meetings that I do go to, I usually leave that with a generally kind of a sense of ill ease, where I either need counseling or a drink, just to get back on the passions that I believe the university should be. So the question is, when you look back on your career, because your career straddles both those dimensions of living and working in the university, when you made decisions to get involved in the administration and the politics or the governance of the university, you do that at sacrifice, because you sacrifice a lot of the other passions and the time that you have to devote to those passions of teaching, learning, and research. And you give that to the university. And some of us who are passionate about the other aspects of our prime objective here in the university worry, and this isn't peculiar to UCT, this is probably true across the world. They're getting involved in the administration and the governance of the university robs us of some of the passions to make the biggest difference in the lives of our communities. And so if you look back on your career, do you think that was a sacrifice that was worth making?
Yes, I must confess that it's a difficult one to answer because I had enormous regrets. You'll read in the book that, again, UCT had one of its small-minded moments when it took up the question of my successor in my own department, because I had set it up in such a way that I could continue to be able to be very productive on the research side. But a choice was made of a new successor who disrupted the whole thing and eventually caused the whole research group to dissipate. So therefore, I regret very much that happened, because it was a very, very fine group of people. However, I tried in administration to use scholarly principles and to be involved mainly with scholarship. So, for example, when the university had a project called AIM, which was a very massive consultancy, and everything was being examined to see whether all the processes could be streamlined and turned into sort of AI in embryo. I lost interest. It just didn't interest me at all, this aspect of it. I was interested in the human side. I was very interested in contacts. I made so many friends as a DVC in the different faculties. And it was so fantastic that those friendships flowered, because I could talk to people wherever they were about their interests and so on. So I don't regret that. And even though the academic planning framework was a partial failure, parts of it were very successful, parts were not. I did try, for example, I've not had time to mention the cooperation between institutions. I thought, this is crazy. We have 5 libraries. At that time, there were 5 higher education institutions and 5 university libraries, and they all struggle for budgets to buy books. Why don't they join, and if one has a book, it's for everybody. So, within reason, I mean, obviously. So therefore we started the Vice Rectors Group, which became the Adamastor Trust, which became the Cape Higher Education Consortium. And so, again, that was fantastic to do that. We were planning a science museum in Cape Town on the parade in the old drill hall. Cooperatively, the 5 institutions came to nothing, because Mike Bruton decided to start one in Century City. So all kinds of things happen in this exciting life. But I just want to say that I never regretted changing because of my fox-like character. And therefore, the fox is always looking for fences to jump over into new terrains. Thank you.
Hi, Wieland. This is Muhlopeni Jackson. Thanks for everything. So I started late at UCT, but I still had great mentorship from you and the many things that you have done for me. So in fact, recently I took a position as a director of HSRC Center for TB Research. So at my welcome in Stellenbosch, they gave me a badge that says Center for Molecular and Cellular Cardiology. And they told me that center was the first MRC center opened around 1975 by Wieland Gevers. So I have it in my office right now. But what I wanted to say is the very impressive bringing together an institute like IDM as a model of research that brought international researchers in one space to lead research, globally as we know it. What was the secret to the funding model to bring together such an amazing institute that we have with a global standing. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mohlopeni, and congratulations on your recent appointment to be the director of that centre, MRC Centre. And if I can just briefly say that the Institute for Infectious Disease and Molecular Medicine, the IDM, was another project, another fence in which this fox jumped over, having just retired as senior DVC, armed with all the knowledge that one needed. I then began work at the Health Sciences faculty to begin to put together two initiatives that had more or less stalled into one initiative which had enough momentum to be viable. We had to work against, at the then powers at Bremner building, where this was popularly known as Wieland's folly. And we had a lot of uphill about getting approvals and getting people to do what was necessary.
You've got www.
Yeah. Anyway, so the thing is that the Institute is now in grave trouble, I'm afraid, because of the recent NIH cuts, and so I won't talk about it too much, but it was a wonderful venture. It is still really difficult to see how the university can have a multi-faculty, multi-departmental institute which has a physical presence and which works the way that institute research works and empowers people across lines and labs to work together. It's still difficult to know how that fits with the departmental model. So I think it has worked well, and they've been superb directors, Greg Hussey and Val Mizrahi, and now Digby Warner. So it is a sort of wonderful entity and a very large asset for UCT.
I just want to thank you for saying that, Mohlopeni, that Prof sort of encouraged you. He brought me to UCT and literally threw me into the mess of mucus, and he said, you should work with this. And whenever I was introduced at an international conference, once by the late Professor Solly Marx, he said, this is Anwar Mall and he swims in slime. Any other question? Any other question? Yeah.
I'm just standing to thank my friend and to say to all of us, particularly UCT people, we haven't thanked Wieland enough. There's no way I could have done half the things I did at UCT without Wieland. And the reason for our complementary and wonderful relationship that lasts to date is that we both recognize that we bring different strengths to the relationship. And I never pretended to be a scientist. I never pretended to be an academic. I never was and never will be. But by having Wieland as the senior deputy vice chancellor, literally the person who was running the academic enterprise, I couldn't run it because I didn't know how all the nooks and crannies. So I was the kind of slime cleaner to keep the machine going. And Wieland, what you also did for this country has not been fully realized. You protected the higher education system from the madness of Sakwa. We used to call him Mr. Sakwa. I don't know how anybody other than you with your fox mind but your huge brain could have found a way out of that mess to get a higher education that can function logically and smartly. And finally, UCT benefited in more ways than one. It's not a question of the right idea at the wrong time. Ideas can be planted and they can take decades, sometimes centuries. But the idea remains true. It's like a spirit. It never dies. It will find ways. And I think what you have done for this institution, for your country, and for this rural bumpkin from Limpopo who didn't know anything, I can't thank you enough. Thank you.